And welcome back. Members of the European Parliament have branded Russia as a state sponsor of terrorism in a legally non-binding resolution which has been welcomed by Ukraine. Lawmakers also urged the European Union's executive to accelerate work on a ninth package of sanctions against Moscow over its invasion of Ukraine. In response to the declaration, a Russian Foreign Ministry spokesperson said the European Parliament should be labelled as a sponsor of idiocy. SABC correspondent Donnacha Ó Beacháin breaks down what happened in Brussels.
In this resolution, European Union parliamentarians accuse Moscow of committing deliberate acts and atrocities against Ukrainian civilians, destroying civilian infrastructure in Ukraine and breaching international law. Now, they say these amount to acts of terror as part of what they call Russia's brutal war of aggression against Ukraine. Those may be harsh words, but they aren't much more than that legally. The European Union does not have any kind of framework in place under which Russia can officially be designated as a terrorist state or a state sponsor of terrorism. And that means this resolution has no concrete consequences. But here's Swedish lawmaker Evan Insier on why she thinks this still matters.
Words paves the way for actions. The Putin Russian regime is a terrorist state and is a state sponsor of terrorism. If not the aggression on Ukraine, violation of other states' territorial integrity and sovereignty, and the cold-blooded killings of dissenters are ground enough to be called out for state sponsor of terrorism, and being a terrorist state, I do not know what would be.
These words certainly do matter to Ukraine. Foreign Minister Dmytro Kuleba has thanked the European Parliament for taking what he calls a clear stance. But there are critics of this move, even if it's only symbolic. Some argue this kind of messaging could reduce the space for possible future peace talks and diplomacy. Russia, meanwhile, denies its troops have committed atrocities in Ukraine, but the European Union is not convinced. Donnacha Ó Beacháin, SABC News, Brussels.
Donnacha Ó Beacháin is a professor of politics at the School of Law and Government, Dublin City University, where he lectures on post-Soviet politics. A very good evening to you, and thank you so much for speaking to us. As you might have heard, parts of what my colleague was saying, that is a largely symbolic measure. Why is it important, though, Professor?
Well, as the Swedish lawmaker said, words do matter and symbols matter. And of course, it's not as important as what Russia's doing right now in Ukraine, but it's calling out Russia in a very significant way. It's saying that Russia is a state sponsor of terrorism. And that was proven today. I mean, there was a maternity hospital attacked in Zaporizhzhia. We've seen, war crimes committed in Mariupol, in Bucha, in Kherson. And as we speak today, 67 missiles, fired at Ukraine, and a deliberate attempt to attack the energy infrastructure because the first snowflakes have already fallen. We're heading into a very long winter in Ukraine when temperatures can drop to -20. And cutting off the electricity supply, the gas, the heating to people in Ukraine, as Russia is doing with these missile attacks, is essentially a sentence of death for many people. So this is terrorism. It's state-sponsored, and the EU simply today has called it what it is.
Will we see from here on perhaps the European Parliament working on a legal framework to make this stick? For instance, unlike the United States, they don't have those legal frameworks as the European Parliament.
That's very true, and that's one of the reasons why the United States has been reluctant until now to adopt a similar resolution, because there would be consequences that come with that, because there is, as you say, a legal infrastructure. So the United States, at the moment, there's 4 countries which it has called state sponsors of terrorism. Syria, Cuba, and North Korea are among them. But it hasn't gone to the extent of categorizing Russia in that way for the reasons that it would really be the cutting off of all relations with Russia, and they're not quite ready for that yet. From the EU perspective, yes, words perhaps first and then actions to follow. There have already been resolutions within national parliaments in the European Union, in Latvia and Estonia, in Lithuania, in Poland. The Council of Europe Parliamentary Assembly has also enacted a similar resolution. So it seems that the resolutions, yes, are coming first. They're not, of course, as important as sanctions. The sanctions are already in place. 8 packages of sanctions introduced by consensus, which is often difficult to achieve, of course, in the European Union since February, since the invasion of February. So the European Union always moves as a 27-member, entity rather slowly. But when it moves together, and it can take decisive action when it acts together.
As you say that the United States is circumspect about taking this move itself, what would it mean if the EU does do that? And I also want to understand, what is the difference between designating Russia as a sponsor of terrorism and what it has as its terror list, EU terrorist list? So I believe that allows the bloc to designate individuals as terrorists. So what does it mean when you designate a country as a sponsor of state terrorism?
Well, that will be something for the European Union to tease out. They haven't made clear what their intentions are. This is an action, of course, as well as one part of the European Union. The European Union is made up of the European Commission, kind of the bureaucracy, the Council of Ministers, which is kind of the prime ministers and the cabinets of different countries. So this is the Parliament, and Parliament is composed of individual parties drawn from the different countries. And this resolution was sponsored by 3 parties who might be considered to be centre and centre-right. It got an overwhelming majority. Out of the 700 members of Parliament, only 58 voted against. But they haven't made clear where they intend to go from this. So I would be speculating if I was to say what it would mean for Russia. That's still not entirely clear. As I said, the main focus has been up until now getting unity on sanctions. And as you know, Russia had relied heavily on the notion that it could divide and rule with the European Union because of the fact that it has different members with different interests. Many of them, of course, have a dependency traditionally on Russian gas. And therefore, Putin had assumed that it would be difficult to get unanimity on these kinds of issues, but he has been proven wrong on this.
And what I'd like to know is, if this is seen as a foreign policy tool of sorts, does this mean that the European Union Parliament is confident that all member states would pull in the same way, as you say, they have done in terms of isolating, a comprehensive isolation of Russia, including diplomatic relations, cutting off diplomatic relations with Russia?
I wouldn't say they're confident they'll get unanimity because, again, the need for consensus means you get the lowest common denominator. Hungary has been, under Viktor Orban, their premier, has been a notorious outlier. And, you know, I saw Hungarian parliamentarians arguing today that this resolution, for example, would exacerbate tensions, would make it more difficult to reach a diplomatic solution. So Hungary, almost alone, has been undermining some of these efforts. So whether they would get unanimity, it's not, entirely obvious, but certainly they would have an overwhelming majority in favor of more robust action, because there's an increasing incredulity and impatience with Russia. As I said, the way that they have now targeted the civilian population after so many military defeats in recent months, having seen several thousand square kilometers of territory recaptured around Kharkiv and Kherson, they have kind of moved away from military victories and as I said, are now targeting civilians. And this is one of the reasons, as I said, there's this mobilization of opinion. Some might call it letting off steam to a certain extent, but as I said, I would expect more robust actions to follow. But it will be difficult to get that unanimity, as it always is. And
an interesting term that you use there, Professor, mobilization of opinion, because the final text reads that it's denouncing Russia's what is called illegal illegal, unprovoked, unjustified war of aggression, which we know that Russia vehemently denies, and it's got its own set of facts to justify why it says it's not unprovoked, that it believes the Ukraine is itself guilty of its own crimes against humanity in the Donbas region, and that in itself there are proxy wars in this whole conflict.
Yeah, that has been the Russian position. I mean, but it's not. It's one that doesn't resonate with the vast majority of countries. So when we've had votes on these kinds of issues at the UN General Assembly, Russia can usually only rely on about 4 or 5 other dictatorships to come to its assistance. They are Syria, they are Belarus, Eritrea, and North Korea. They're the reliables. Then you have a block of opinion, of course, which is rather indifferent to the conflict. Usually, those countries which are further away. But the rest have been quite firm in calling Russia out. So Russia's, there's an old saying that everybody's entitled to their own opinion, but not entitled to their own facts. Russia's facts are not accepted by the vast majority of world opinion. So we can't simply say there are two sides to this argument, that one side is saying one thing, another side is saying the other. We have to test this by saying, well, are these facts considered credible? Are they perceived to be credible by the vast majority of world opinion? And as I said, every time there's been a vote in the UN General Assembly, Russia's found very few people. And as I said, those people they have found are other dictators. I mean, they're not democratic countries that are kind of rushing to support Russia's interpretation of what's happening on the ground.